All right, this morning we're going to look at some Baptist history, and we do that most Sundays. This morning I want to look at a man that his name's Robert Jordan, and his testimony. Robert Jordan was born in 1925 and in Dayton, Ohio. And his story when he was younger is really compelling. When he was 2 years old, he was born into a bad home, a very abusive marriage, and when he was 2 years old, his mother had an adulterous affair, and that ended the marriage. The father remarried, but the stepmother was evidently excessively cruel. And when he was only 3 years old, and this is the interesting part of his story, was when he was 3 years old, he and his 5-year-old sister ran away. That's not the end of the story. They took with them their 1-year-old sister, and they took turns carrying the 1-year-old sister all the way across. Somehow they made it all the way across the city of Dayton, Ohio, and found their grandparents' home. At that point, the children were turned over to the authorities. They went to an orphanage. Well, it was this 3-year-old orphan. He began to learn very early the pecking order in an orphanage, and the older boys, of course, would beat up the younger boys, and there were like 10 cottages of boys, and these boys would just bully these little kids. As he got older, his goal was to be the big boy and to be able to beat all the other boys. Gradually, he fought his way to the top, and he was the top big boy, beating all other boys in 9 other cottages. He hated school. He was a constant irritation to his teachers, and at 15, he was in the 6th grade. The future seemed like there was no hope. But then the world changed on December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and everything was altered. Jordan, at this point, was 16 years old, but his cottage father signed for him, and at 16 years of age, he found himself on a train headed for Great Lakes Naval Station here in Chicago at 16. There he learned the pecking order in the military, and he early determined to climb up the ranks. He wanted to be a leader. He had to kind of fight a lot, but that led him to a lot of drinking, and drinking became a way of life for him. One time, after getting into a fight, he was ordered by his commanding officer to turn that into maybe something a little more positive, and he was ordered to represent the Navy against the Marines in the boxing competition. He set his goal to become the middleweight champion of the Navy, and he became that, the middleweight champion of the entire Navy eventually. He was assigned to the Pacific in World War II. It was there they learned in a terrible way firsthand the Japanese suicide attacks. One time he was a leader of the squadron. A suicide bomber destroyed his entire turret, killing all the men underneath him. That really worsened his drinking habit, and he hated 2 things. He hated the Japanese, and he hated, this is interesting, his stepmother. And he determined that he was going to kill her. And so on his furlough, he tried several times to kill her, but was thwarted each time. Interesting, the bitterness and the hatred. The war came to an end. He re-enlisted for 6 years, became a Navy chief. He was assigned to a cruiser in Philadelphia. He was disgusted to learn, however, that he had 72 men that he had to train, 72 new recruits. And here's a bitter young man of 22 years of age, just a hateful bully, fighter, and had seen terrible things in war, had become an alcoholic just out of his teenage years. And he picked out one of the recruits that seemed to smile too much. And he picked him out, and he began to heap his anger and his bitterness and bulliness on that recruit. The young man's name was Tim, and every time he verbally and maybe physically abused him, Tim would just smile. And it's interesting that eventually he realized that Tim was kind of a friend, and they became companions. And Tim would go with his chief to to the bars at night. Tim would sit and drink milk, and the chief would get drunk, and then Tim would help his drunken chief back to the ship. One time, Tim insisted on giving him a business card of his brother who was a preacher. And he asked the chief, he said, whenever he needed a friend, to go visit his brother. Well, one time he was docked in Bermuda, and he had been drinking excessively, got into a fight, and that landed him into jail. And he realized that he had destroyed his chances of any kind of promotion, and he really was despairing for his future. He went back to his home port. He went to Atlantic City and began drinking more. He spent the weekend drinking, and at that evening he was drunk, and he was out on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And he became, doesn't explain exactly, but he became paralyzed. He was partially paralyzed. He couldn't move. And in that state, he lay there on the boardwalk, and a hippie wandered by. And a hippie just, taunted him and made fun of him. And one of the things the hippie said that God would use to change his life is the hippie said, "You are who you are when you're totally alone." And the chief had pretended to be a macho man, a tough guy, and he was. But he knew that when he was alone, he was very insecure and very afraid. And he couldn't shake that statement. That statement bothered him for a long time. Upon return, he decided to go back to his ship, so he reached in his pocket to get his trolley fare, and all he found in his pocket was the business card to Tim's brother. He thought, well, why not get a free meal? He had nothing to lose. So he boarded a streetcar, and he arrived at Tim's brother's house at around midnight. Well, he rang the doorbell, and when Tim's brother came to the door, he introduced himself, and he said, "Your brother, Tim, said that you would like a visit from me." Well, here I am. And Tim's brother, Frank, said immediately, "Bob, where are you going when you die?" And that took him by surprise. He didn't expect that to be the first statement. And he said, he kind of addressed that with some profanity. And then he claimed he was going to heaven because he was not bad enough to go to hell. And so Frank rankled him even more by insisting that he was going to hell because he had not received Jesus Christ as a Savior. All this is transpiring at the door. And as the conversation continued, Frank invited Bob in and asked him to come in and eat. The chief agreed, and after enjoying the meal, he pushed back from the table and he said, "Now you can go ahead and talk to me about religion." And Frank insisted he wasn't interested in talking religion, but he wanted to explain the reality of a personal relationship with God. And the chief didn't know the difference, but Frank explained very clearly that religion is man's futile attempt to reach God by his own effort, whereas the Bible Christianity is God reaching out to man with the free gift of salvation. The two talked till 8 in the morning, and Frank invited the chief to return, which he did. Night after night, Bob would return to Frank's house and talked. And while the conversation is taking place, of course, God is working on his heart, and along with that, for the first time in his life, he realized that he was witnessing probably love for the first time in his life. And the story's a little bit longer, so we're going to finish this next week. But I was just thinking as I was preparing for this, Pastor Dameron last night encouraged the men. I challenged us last night to purposely this year take a little extra thought and think about souls. And if nothing else, taking the time to pass out tracts and just say that encouraging word to an unsaved person. And you think about this young man, Tim, who had a terrible situation. His chief was verbally and physically abusive to him. He had no place to run and hide. That was his chief. And yet he turned that into a witness. And that witness was simply, "Call my brother if you ever need a friend." And God would use that, and we'll see what happens next week.